You know, sometimes God chooses the most ordinary people to carry the most extraordinary messages. I think about that every time I remember Grace Martinez, a 9-year-old cafeteria manager from Iowa. For 23 years, she served food to children, smiled through the noise of lunchrooms, and went home tired but grateful. She wasn't a preacher or a prophet, just a simple woman with a simple faith. But isn't that just like God? He delights in taking ordinary people and doing something remarkable through them. Grace didn't have a platform, but heaven gave her one. She didn't plan to be a messenger, but heaven wrote her story. One October morning, her life changed forever. What began as another ordinary day, a cup of coffee, 2 pieces of toast, and a drive to work, became the doorway to something divine. In a moment, everything she knew shifted. She found herself standing between this world and the next, where the light of eternity is brighter than the sun, where fear disappears and only peace remains. And there, she met the one she had loved all her life, Jesus Christ, face to face. Can you imagine that? To look into eyes that have seen every sorrow, every struggle, and yet still radiate love beyond words. Grace said she felt more alive than ever before. Isn't that what God does? He takes what looks like the end and turns it into a beginning. He uses the unexpected moments, the ones that break us, shake us, and leave us wondering, to reveal that He's been there all along. What Grace experienced wasn't just about her. It was a wake-up call to the world. God was saying, pay attention, time is short, but my mercy is still here. Sometimes we think only pastors or prophets can hear from heaven. But maybe, just maybe, God is speaking to the cafeteria worker, the teacher, the truck driver, the single mom, because their hearts are open. Grace didn't have power or prestige, but she had something better, a willing spirit. And that's all God needs to turn a simple life into a divine story. So when you hear her testimony, don't just listen for the drama of it, listen for the whisper of grace in it. Because her story is our reminder, God still speaks, God still saves, and God still uses everyday people to prepare the world for what's coming. And maybe, just maybe, He's whispering to you too, right where you are, to be ready, to pray, and to believe that even in the most ordinary life, heaven can break through. It was supposed to be just another ordinary morning for Grace Martinez. She woke up early, made herself a simple breakfast, and drove off to work like she had done for over 2 decades. The sun was rising over the quiet streets of Iowa, and everything seemed so normal, so peaceful. But isn't it true life can change in an instant? One moment you're sipping your coffee, thinking about the day ahead, and the next you're standing face to face with eternity. Grace had no warning. She was simply crossing an intersection when a delivery truck, whose driver had fallen asleep at the wheel, slammed into her car. Metal twisted, glass shattered, and time itself seemed to stop. When the noise faded, Grace realized something extraordinary. She wasn't in her body anymore. She was floating above the wreckage, watching paramedics rush toward the crushed car that still held her lifeless form. But she felt no pain, no fear, only peace. She said it was like being wrapped in a warm embrace that no words could describe. Have you ever felt that kind of peace, the kind that doesn't make sense? The kind that comes only when heaven touches earth? Grace said she saw everything so clearly, as if her spirit had finally awakened from the heavy fog of this world. Then she saw it, a light unlike any she had ever known. Not the harsh glare of a hospital lamp, but a radiant, living light calling her forward. She said it was brighter than 1,000 suns, yet soft like love itself. That light wasn't just light, it was life, it was home. And as she moved toward it, every worry, every regret, every ounce of pain melted away. She wasn't afraid to die because, in that moment, she realized she was finally alive. When I hear stories like Grace's, I'm reminded that we often think the end is the end, but to God, it's just the beginning. Sometimes He allows the crash, the chaos, the moment that shakes everything, because it's in that broken place that we see what's eternal. Maybe you've been through your own kind of collision, a loss, a setback, a moment that took the breath right out of your lungs. But friend, what if that wasn't the end? What if God is trying to lift you above the wreckage and show you that there's more light, more life, more purpose? Grace's story isn't just about death, it's about awakening. It's a reminder that this world is temporary, but God's love, His light, is forever. Grace said that as she moved closer to that radiant light, she realized it wasn't just brightness, it was a presence. It was love itself. Grace said that when the angel of America stepped forward, the entire courtroom seemed to shift. The light dimmed just enough to make every word echo with weight. His face was strong yet sorrowful, and in his hands he held a scroll sealed with red wax. When he broke it open, Grace said she could feel the air change, like heaven itself was grieving. The angel's voice was deep and steady, but filled with pain. "The land once called a beacon of hope," he said, "has turned its eyes away from the one who blessed it. Pleasure has replaced prayer. Entertainment has replaced righteousness. Comfort has replaced holiness." And with those words, Grace was no longer in the courtroom. She was standing in America. She found herself on a hillside in California, overlooking beautiful homes, sunshine, and laughter. Children played in yards. Parents washed their cars. Everything looked peaceful, just like any other afternoon. But then she saw a small cloud of smoke rising in the distance. At first it seemed harmless, like the kind of wildfire that makes the evening news. But within moments, that smoke became a roaring wall of fire, hundreds of feet high, devouring everything in its path. The heat was so intense, houses didn't just burn, they exploded. People tried to flee, but the roads were jammed. Grace said it was chaos, fear, and heartbreak all at once. And in that moment she realized this wasn't just about nature. It was a reflection of a nation's soul burning from the inside out. Then, as suddenly as it began, the vision shifted. She stood now in the heart of the Midwest flatlands, farms, churches, and small towns. The sky turned green and purple, swirling with power. And then she heard it, the sound like a freight train. Tornadoes. Not one or two, but dozens, massive, violent, unstoppable. Grace said they tore through towns like a giant's angry hand, leveling schools, churches, and homes. Families hid, praying, but the destruction came faster than they could move. She could feel the anguish of mothers calling out for their children, the silence after the storm, the weight of loss too deep for words. When she returned to that heavenly courtroom, the angel of America was weeping. Even angels cry when they see what sin destroys. But through his tears, he spoke again. "Lord, there are still those who love you in this land. There are still grandmothers praying, still children learning your name. For their sake, show mercy." And isn't that true for all of us? No matter how far a nation drifts, there are still faithful hearts holding it up in prayer. Grace's vision reminds us that even when the fires rage and the storms roar, God is still listening. Judgment may be written, but mercy is still within reach if we'll only turn our hearts back to Him. Grace said that when the angel of China stepped forward, the air in that heavenly courtroom grew heavy, like the moment before a storm. His presence was strong, his expression full of both power and sorrow. In his hands, he held a scroll that trembled slightly, as if even heaven grieved for what was written there. When he broke the seal, his voice rang out, not angry, but mournful. The nation of China, he began, has sought power over peace, control over compassion, and has tried to erase the name of God from its land. Yet, even in the mountains, in hidden rooms and secret places, my people still whisper prayers. Grace said those words pierced her heart. Because even in a land of darkness, God still has light believers who refuse to let go of their faith, no matter the cost. In a flash, the courtroom faded, and Grace found herself standing in the middle of a great Chinese city, crowded streets, towering skyscrapers, millions of people moving with purpose. Everything looked ordinary, but then the ground began to shake. At first, it was just a gentle tremor, the kind that makes you pause and wonder, but within seconds, the earth began to roar. Buildings swayed like branches in a storm. Glass shattered, concrete split open, and in moments, entire skyscrapers began to collapse. Grace said it was like watching a wave of destruction race across the land, unstoppable, merciless, absolute. The ground tore open beneath her, swallowing cars, buses, even people. But that was only the beginning. In the distance, she saw the explosion, bright, blinding, horrifying. A nuclear plant had ruptured, and invisible death began to spread across the city. People who had survived the earthquake were now running from the unseen poison in the air. Hospitals overflowed, doctors collapsed from exhaustion, mothers searched for their children through the rubble. Grace said it was suffering beyond imagination, not because God was cruel, but because the world had chosen to forget him. And then, just as quickly, she was back in the heavenly courtroom. The angel of China closed his scroll, tears streaming down his radiant face. Lord, he said, they have sinned, but there are still millions who love you, men and women who worship in secret, who risk prison and death just to speak your name. For their sake, have mercy. Grace said the room grew still. Even in heaven, you could feel the weight of that plea. When I think of that moment, I'm reminded that faith isn't proven when life is easy, it's proven in the fire. Those believers in hidden churches may never stand on a stage or hold a microphone, but they hold heaven's attention. And maybe that's what God is asking us today. When the world shakes, will your faith still stand? Grace's vision reminds us that even in the darkest places, light still shines, and even in judgment, mercy is still reaching out. Grace said that when the third angel stepped forward, the atmosphere in heaven shifted again. This time it carried both reverence and sorrow, like the sound of a violin playing a song of history and heartbreak. This angel looked ancient, as if his very being carried the story of generations. His eyes were filled with love for his land, yet heavy with grief. He held a scroll, unlike the others, etched with gold, marked with the covenant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When he opened it, the courtroom grew silent. This, he said, is the land of promise, the land chosen by God. Yet the people who were given light have turned from it. They have seen the Messiah, and still many wait for the one who has already come. Grace said as those words echoed, she felt herself transported once again, this time to a hill overlooking Jerusalem. The golden dome of the rock gleamed under the sun, the ancient walls stood strong, and the streets buzzed with life, Jews, Muslims, Christians, tourists, all going about their day. It was a picture of peace. But suddenly, the sky was torn by the sound of sirens. People began to run, looking upward. From every direction, north, south, east, she saw missiles streaking through the air, leaving trails of smoke. Within moments, explosions rocked the city. Buildings that had stood for centuries crumbled. Fire rose where prayers had been whispered for thousands of years. And as the chaos unfolded, Grace saw something even more devastating, not just the battle of armies, but the isolation of a nation. She saw the world turning against Israel leaders on screens, declaring that the small nation was to blame for its own suffering. Allies withdrew their support, and Israel stood alone, surrounded, misunderstood, and forsaken. Grace said it was a loneliness that went beyond war, it was spiritual. The world had turned its back, but heaven had not. Amid the smoke and the cries, she saw groups of people praying, soldiers kneeling beside their weapons, mothers clutching their children, rabbis and believers in hidden corners whispering, "God of Abraham, have mercy." When Grace returned to that heavenly courtroom, the angel of Israel stood weeping. "Yes, Lord," he said, "they have rejected Yeshua, yet they are still your covenant people, the apple of your eye. There is a remnant that still believes, still intercedes. For their sake, have mercy." Grace said, the words hung in the air, trembling with love and pain. And as I think about that, I realize even in rejection, God's promise stands. He doesn't forget what he's spoken. Nations may turn away, but his covenant never dies. Sometimes God allows shaking not to destroy, but to awaken, to draw his people back to himself. Grace's vision of Israel wasn't just about war, it was about redemption. It was a reminder that when the world walks away, heaven still fights for the promise. Grace said that after witnessing the visions of fire, storms, earthquakes, and war, she found herself once more in that radiant courtroom of heaven. The light seemed softer now, almost tender, as if creation itself was holding its breath. Before the throne stood the three great angels, the guardians of America, China, and Israel. Their once bright faces were streaked with tears, their scrolls sealed again and clutched tightly to their hearts. And then something beautiful happened. These mighty beings, who had just declared judgment, fell to their knees. Their voices trembled as they began to plead, not for themselves, but for us. Grace said it was one of the most moving sights she had ever seen, power bowing before mercy. The angel of America spoke first. His voice was strong, but his tone broke with emotion. "Lord," he said, "though many have turned away, there are still those who rise before dawn to pray. There are grandmothers on their knees crying for their children. There are young people resisting the pull of darkness. There are churches that still burn with love for you. For their sake, remember mercy." Grace said you could almost feel those prayers rising like incense, filling heaven's halls. Then the angel of China stepped forward. "Master," he said, "my people have suffered much. They are beaten, imprisoned, silenced, but they still worship. They gather in secret, whispering your name. They risk everything for one page of scripture. Their courage grows in the shadows. For their sake, remember mercy." Grace said it was as if heaven itself trembled at those words, because even in the darkest corners of the world, light still flickers. Finally, the angel of Israel approached. His eyes burned with devotion and pain. "Holy One of Israel," he said, "you made a covenant with Abraham, and you do not forget. Though many are blind to their Messiah, there is a remnant that believes, that prays for their nation day and night. They cry out for the peace of Jerusalem. For their sake, remember mercy." Grace said the courtroom was silent after that. The angels, creatures of unimaginable strength, waited humbly for God's response. And in that stillness, she realized something profound. Even when judgment is written, mercy still pleads. Heaven is not indifferent to our prayers. The angels themselves are intercessors, standing in the gap when nations fall short. When I think about that moment, I can't help but feel hope. Because if heaven is still praying for us, then there's still time. God hasn't given up on America, or China, or Israel, or on you. Grace's vision reminds us that mercy is stronger than wrath, and that even when the verdict seems sealed, love still has the final word. Grace said that after the angels finished pleading, an awe-filled silence covered the courtroom like heaven itself was waiting for the heartbeat of God. Then, suddenly, the silence was broken by a voice. It wasn't loud in the way thunder is loud. It was loud in the way truth shakes your soul. It was a voice that carried eternity in its tone. Grace said every being in that courtroom bowed low as the voice spoke. The scrolls have been sealed. The dates have been set, November 9th, 10th, and 11th. But mercy still stands for those who will seek it. Those words echoed like waves of both justice and love. Judgment was real, yes, but so was grace. God wasn't closing the door yet. He was saying, "Come while there's still time." Grace said she looked around and saw the angels still holding their scrolls, their heads bowed, still whispering prayers for their nations. Even in that moment of decree, mercy was alive, still reaching, still calling. Then Jesus turned to her. His eyes were filled with compassion, but also purpose. "Grace," he said gently, "you have seen what few have seen. Now you must go back. Tell my people what you have witnessed. Warn them, but remind them that I am still merciful. Tell them not to fear, but to pray." She didn't argue, though her heart trembled. She said it was like standing in the center of a holy storm, feeling both the weight of judgment and the warmth of love. Then, before she could even breathe, she felt herself being pulled backward through light, through sound, through time itself. The courtroom faded, the angels disappeared, and she found herself falling fast. When she opened her eyes, there were bright hospital lights above her, machines beeping beside her, and pain rushing back into her body. She was alive again, but she would never be the same. When I think about that moment, I can't help but imagine what she must have felt, to be standing in heaven, hearing the voice of God, then waking up in a hospital bed with the weight of the world on her heart. But here's the beauty of it. God didn't send her back to scare anyone. He sent her back to remind us that mercy is still available. Those dates weren't meant to create fear. They were meant to awaken faith. They were heaven's way of saying, don't waste another day. Friend, we don't need to have a near-death experience to hear God's call. Every sunrise is another chance to turn our hearts toward Him. Grace's story isn't just about judgment, it's about invitation. The scrolls may be sealed, but the door of grace is still wide open. Grace said when her eyes opened in that hospital room, she could still feel heaven in her heart. The smell of antiseptic filled the air. Machines beeped steadily beside her, and nurses whispered in the hallway, but her spirit was still standing in that heavenly courtroom. She wasn't the same woman who had driven to work that morning. Something eternal had marked her. And right there, lying in that hospital bed, she realized God had sent her back with a message not just for herself, but for the world. She said, "I am just Grace, a cafeteria worker from Iowa. I don't have a title or a pulpit, but heaven gave me something to say." And her message was clear. 3 nations, America, China, and Israel, are standing at a crossroads. Judgment has been written, but mercy can still rewrite the story. What she saw wasn't meant to terrify, it was meant to awaken. Grace said, "The severity of what's coming depends on how we respond." In other words, prayer can still move mountains. Repentance can still open heaven's windows. And when people humble themselves before God, the flames of destruction can turn into the fires of revival. She urged everyone who heard her story not to wait for someone else to pray, not to think they're too small to matter. She said, "You don't have to be famous to touch heaven. You just have to be faithful. Whether you're in a busy city, a quiet village, or a small kitchen in Iowa, your prayer can make a difference." She encouraged believers everywhere to take 5 minutes a day, just 5 minutes, to pray for mercy over America, for awakening in China, and for peace in Israel. Every prayer, she said, is like a light pushing back the darkness. Grace's voice carried urgency, but it also carried peace. Don't be afraid, she told people. Fear doesn't help anyone, faith does. God showed me these things not so we'd panic, but so we'd prepare. The door of grace is still open, but it won't stay open forever. When I think about her words, I'm reminded that God often uses the ordinary to bring extraordinary reminders. Maybe He's using Grace's story to reach us, to stir something inside our hearts. Maybe He's saying, come back while there's still time, because mercy is still stronger than judgment, and prayer is still more powerful than fear. Grace didn't come back with despair. She came back with hope, a hope that reminds us that no matter how dark the days get, heaven is still listening, and grace still has the final word.